Friends, welcome to part 2 of the church during the Enlightenment as we now focus on the third expression of Christianity that we often follow. So we've looked at the Protestant, we've looked at the Eastern Orthodox, and now we're going to tie back in what was going on with the Catholic Church. Now, I mentioned a little bit about it in the previous episode, so if you haven't yet listened or watched that one, you can go back to it. But this episode is primarily concerned with what was going on within the Catholic Church as the Enlightenment was raging around it. So we've looked at some of the other expressions already, and now we're going to focus on Rome. So here's what you need to know. By the 1800s, the Roman Catholic Church found itself in a world that was changing at a pace few generations had experienced. And of course, this was the Enlightenment that we talked about last week. And the Enlightenment had elevated human reason as the final authority in many intellectual circles. So political revolutions were toppling monarchies, and entire nations were being restructured. Industrialization was playing a role in this too, as it was shaping the everyday life of Europe, as we mentioned before. So for the Catholic Church, long intertwined with Europe and European culture and the political statuses and systems of its day, these changes brought both crisis and necessary transformation. Now, one of the most significant developments for the Catholic Church in this era was the gradual loss of the papal states. So for centuries, the Pope had not only been a spiritual leader, but also a political ruler over a large region in central Italy. But in the 19th century, the movement for Italian unification began to absorb these territories. And by 1870, Rome itself was taken, and the Pope lost his temporal authority. This moment marked the end of a long era. The Pope would no longer rule as a political monarch. For the Catholic Church, this raised a profound question. If the Church no longer has political and social power, how should its authority be exercised? Now, in response to the turbulence of the modern world, Pope Pius IX called the First Vatican Council. This is known as Vatican I. That should be a hint that there's going to be a Vatican II later on. Now, this council met between 1869 and 1870, and it brought together bishops from around the world to address the church's identity in the rapidly changing age. Two major issues stood at the center of Vatican I. First was the challenge of modern thought. It was the rise of rationalism and the Enlightenment and the secular philosophy that had led many people to question revelation, miracles, church authority, even the existence of God. So at Vatican I, the Catholic Church responded by reaffirming that divine revelation is real and that reason alone is not sufficient to grasp ultimate truth. That is to say that the work of the rationalists and the work of the Enlightenment, reasonable people, as it were, was not enough to bring ultimate truth. It could reveal truth in part, but it needed something more. Now, second, it also brought up the controversial decision that has to do with papal authority and infallibility. At Vatican I, the Council defined the doctrine of papal infallibility, which is the teaching that when the Pope speaks ex cathedra, which means from the chair of Peter, on matters of faith and morals, then he is preserved from error by the Holy Spirit. Now, this did not mean that popes were sinless or they were always correct in every statement they made. But it does mean that under specific conditions, the Pope's teaching was considered protected from doctrinal error. This was a direct response, of course, to a world of increasing confusion and competing authorities and competing Christian voices. So the Catholic Church was in effect saying, in a modern world full of shifting ideas, we will have a clear center of authority. Now, of course, this will not sit well with Protestants, but they are not really under the Catholic Church's authority anyway. Shortly after Vatican I concluded, Italian troops went in and they captured Rome in 1870. So then the Pope lost control of the papal states and withdrew into the Vatican, refusing to recognize the authority of the new Italian government. And for nearly 60 years afterwards, popes would refer to themselves as the prisoner of the Vatican. It was a symbolic expression of the church's new reality. No political power, but a spiritual institution navigating a modern nation-state world. And yet, while Catholic political influence in Europe was declining, something else was happening at the same time. Catholicism, much like the Orthodox and much like the Protestant traditions we looked at last episode, was also spreading globally through their own missionary efforts, such as through the Jesuits, the Franciscans, and other orders. The Catholic Church expanded significantly, especially into places of Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Pacific Islands. In many of these regions, Catholic missionaries built schools. They established hospitals and churches. They were often learning the languages and establishing long-term communities. So even as the church was losing the political control in Europe, it was growing in a global sense. And by the late 19th century, the Catholic Church found itself in a unique position. It was not only the bishops and popes that were shaping the era. God was also raising up individual voices, people whose lives and work showed what faith looks like in this changing, dynamic world. One of these voices was Catherine Macaulay. In the early 1800s, as industrial cities like Dublin expanded, poverty and suffering increased dramatically. So Macaulay used her inheritance not for personal comfort, but to serve those in need. She opened a house for the poor, especially women and children, and eventually founded what we know as the Sisters of Mercy in 1831. Her work began a living expression of the church's compassion in a harsh industrial age. And while the world was changing through machines and factories, she reminded the church that faith must also be expressed through mercy, education, and care for the vulnerable. At the same time, the Catholic Church was also engaging the modern world at the level of reason and ideas. One of the most important intellectual voices of this 19th century was a man by the name of John Henry Newman. Originally an Anglican priest and leader in the Oxford movement, Newman wrestled deeply with questions about authority, about truth, and he wrestled with what it meant to see doctrine develop. Was there something to the development of doctrine? So in 1845, he converted to Roman Catholicism, a move that shocked the religious world in England. And Newman became one of the most significant Catholic thinkers of his time. His influence can be seen all over Vatican I. He argued that Christian doctrine does not change at its core, but it develops and unfolds more clearly over time. In doing so, Newman helped the church engage the modern intellectual world without abandoning its historic foundations. Newman also helped bridge the growing divide between faith and reason, showing that belief in God could stand alongside serious intellectual inquiry. As the century closed, another very different kind of witness and way of life emerged in France, though her impact may have been not as well known until after her death. I'd like you to consider Therese of Lisieux. Therese entered a Carmelite convent at a young age and lived a hidden, quiet life of prayer. She never traveled as a missionary. She never held public influence, and yet her spiritual impact would spread across the world. Therese taught what became known as the little way. The idea that holiness is found not in great achievements, but in small acts of love done faithfully to God. In a world increasingly focused on the industrial progress and the power and the success of modern movements, her message was strikingly countercultural. After her death, which was at the young age of 24, her writings spread widely, and she would later be recognized as one of the most influential saints of the modern era. Together, these three lives show how the Catholic Church responded to the pressures of the modern world. While councils like Vatican I defined doctrine and authority for a changing age, these lives show what faith could look like on the ground, in the cities and the universities and the monasteries. And this reminds us, even those of us outside of the Catholic tradition should be reminded that the story of the church is never told only through institutions. It is also carried by ordinary people living faithfully in extraordinary times. So what's our practical takeaway as we close this part 2 section? Well, this part of the Catholic Church's history reminds us of a very deep reality. When everything around us is changing, people desperately look for that which does not. When the world is changing fast, and perhaps we can relate in the 21st century, especially with the developments of AI, questions about what is truth, what is work, what is reason, things that we've seen throughout history, but seem to be propelling at an impossible rate. When all of this stuff is changing, people desperately want to see something that is stable, something that gives a concrete foundation, that gives them a firm feeling of being not tossed with the winds and waves of change. People are looking for Jesus Christ, even if they don't know it. Vatican I reflected a desire to anchor faith in a clear source of authority in a world of confusion. Did it do that appropriately? Well, Protestants and Catholics will probably debate that. But the want is understandable. And whether one agrees with all of Vatican I's conclusions or not, the deeper question still remains today. Where does truth come from when culture is constantly shifting? Every generation, whether in its revolutions, its enlightenment, its thoughts, its skepticism, every generation, the church will be forced to answer that question again. And the Christian claim should and does remain the same. Truth is not created by culture. It is revealed by an holy, infinite God, and it is ultimately centered in the person of Jesus Christ.